Quality, comfort, and grip at an affordable price. Whether it's our standard, pro, or elite socks, there's an option for everyone. Try a pair for yourself now at puregripsocks.com.
When it comes to top-end speed boots, the F50s and the Mercurials are easily the two most popular, and you'd be justified in choosing either one. However, they're also two of the most expensive options. But if you don't care about 3 stripes or a swoosh and you just want the best possible speed boots for the money that you pay, I'd make the argument that the 2 best speed boots that money can buy are also 2 of the least expensive. So with that in mind, who makes the better value for money speed boot? Mizuno with the Alpha 2 Elite or Sokito with the Scudetta? Where of course, when I say value for money, neither one of these football boots are exceptionally inexpensive. They're just less expensive than what you would typically pay for a top-end model from the bigger brands, where in the case of the Sokito Scudetta, at full retail, they are going to run you $200, which is definitely on the low end of what you can pay for a top-end football boot these days. Where the Mizunos are available in 2 different top-end variants, the most expensive being the Made in Japan model that retails for an astonishing $320, entirely unaffordable for the vast majority, or you can go for the non-Made in Japan Elite model like I have here that retails for just $180, and it's basically exactly the same from a fit, feel, and experience standpoint. Again, not to say that $180 is cheap, but considering you can pay that much for a first-tier takedown model from Nike and Adidas, I'd say it's pretty good value considering that this is in every single way a top performer in the speed boot category. Both boots that, by the way, you can pick up below their normal retail prices in multiple different colorways by way of some exclusive SR4U coupon codes via the links down below. And really quickly before we keep going, if you enjoy the comparison videos on the channel, don't forget to drop a like on this one. Let me know down in the comments which boots you'd like to see compared next. And if you appreciate the unsponsored, brutally honest, unsugar-coated content on this channel, make sure you hit that subscribe button along with the little bell notification so you don't miss out on my reviews of all the latest football boots of 2025. When it comes to touch on the ball, not to compare every speed boot to an F50 or a Mercurial, but that's kind of the best comparison that I can make because people are so familiar with those 2 lines. The Sokito Scudetta is very reminiscent of a 2014 F50 Adizero from a touch perspective, and the Mizuno Alpha 2 has more of a raw, thin textile synthetic upper that has a little bit more of that kind of Tajin synthetic mercurial pinginess. With the Biotech vamp through the forefoot and toe box area of the Scudetta definitely being the more leather-like material of the 2, again, that hybrid touch upper of the 2014 F50, which is an all-time great, is the obvious comparison to make here. You have a little bit of a micro texture on the surface that does provide some extra grip on the ball, definitely more so than what you're going to find from the Alpha 2. And then of course, as you transition into the midfoot, it changes into a thinner textile material that's there more so for the sake of structure more than anything. And then the tongue itself is a super thin, very unstructured microfiber with really no extra padding whatsoever. If you want something that is thin but still feels soft in the forefoot and toe box area, this is more or less ideal. And as you guys can see by the writing here on the heel, if it means anything to you, all of the materials used here are recycled or renewable in one way or another, and technically the Sokito Scudetta is 100% vegan. Where the Alpha 2 upper is maybe a little bit less interesting from a description perspective, it's one textile-based synthetic all the way through, so very consistent in that regard. There's a little bit of micro texture on the surface just due to the nature of the material, but for the most part, it doesn't provide much in the way of extra grip or much in the way of extra padding. This is for somebody that wants that raw, barefoot sensation both against your foot as well as on the ball, which again is why the Teijin synthetic Mercurial days would be the best comparison. A nice deep central lacing system allows for a really good wrap around your foot, and unlike some of those classic Mercurial models, the Alpha 2 is exceptionally comfortable, which we'll of course talk about a little bit later in the video. So at the end of the day, I would say it is very much a case of personal preference here. Personally, I like the softer feel of the Sokito's upper. However, if that's not your cup of tea, I could see a lot of people leaning towards the Alpha 2. Lockdown and responsiveness is a huge part of what makes a speed boot feel like a speed boot. You want it to have that one-to-one connection to your foot, where the second that you react is the second that the boot responds. And I don't want to get things twisted here, because I think that these are both pretty responsive feeling football boots. It's just a situation where you're comparing really solid responsiveness to arguably the most responsive football boot currently on the market. Where, like we just talked about, in comparison to the Alpha 2, the upper of the Scudetta definitely prioritizes softness and comfort a little bit more so than structure, lockdown, and responsiveness. That is not to say that the fit and lockdown, because of this deep central lacing system, isn't top notch. You're not going to have any issues there, but certainly when you compare it to the Alpha 2, this upper maintains a little bit of extra structure, and most importantly, the entire inside is lined in their zero glide material, where the insole, the heel area, and the underside of the entire upper all the way through the foot has this really soft, kind of grippy silicone sensation that does a tremendous job of grabbing your entire foot and holding it in place. Pair that up with a super deep central lacing system, and the fit, adjustability, and like I said, overall lockdown is pretty much as good as it gets without sacrificing comfort, which is really the important part. Where of course there's still a personal preference choice to be made here, where if you prefer something softer and more forgiving in terms of feel while still overall being very responsive, the Sokito Scudetta might be more up your alley. But for sure, if you just want maximum lockdown and responsiveness, that true one-to-one connection, I don't think anything does it better right now than the Alpha 2. Speaking of responsiveness, let's talk about the underfoot feel of the sole plates, because I think particularly in the speed boot category, this promise of maximum energy return is a major talking point. And I think both of these boots do a pretty decent job of that. Where in the case of the Scudetta, obviously nothing you see looks to be out of the ordinary. It's one piece of plastic all the way through. Although one thing I will say is that Sokito have actually gone and addressed an issue that I had with the original drop, which was the all white colorway, where it would kind of buckle here at the base of the heel. They've now reinforced it where it just has more structure, and the majority of the stiffness where the boot can actually flex is happening in the right spot underneath the forefoot, which doesn't really change the feel of the boot that much. It just in general gives you a little bit more of that solid sensation underfoot, and overall it is definitely an improvement, where from a responsiveness perspective, this is definitely one of the stiffer sole plates that you're going to be able to get on a pair of speed boots without taking away from the softness and flexibility of this upper, where in general, if you're looking for a responsive underfoot feel, while nowhere near what you can get from an F50 Plus or a Puma Ultra Carbon, it is on par with most top-end models. Where the Alpha 2 features more of an insert style construction with the sole plate, where it's a plastic stud plate on top, and then you can see in the forefoot as well as underneath the heel, there's a secondary type of material, where in the forefoot in particular, it looks like carbon fiber. It is in fact just plastic with a carbon pattern kind of printed on top. And from a feel perspective, it obviously does spring back into place quite nicely, but it is more flexible than what you're going to find from the Sokitos, where in general, I think it's a nice solid feel underfoot, but at the same time, the energy return is nothing crazy. This I would compare a little bit more closely, again, to something like an F50, and it is also worth mentioning that in the case of the Made in Japan version of the Alpha 2, they do also include a Carvo insert in the forefoot, which is an extra piece of material, again, designed to kind of spring back into place, making that made in Japan model slightly stiffer through the forefoot. But when it comes to actually playing in the boots, honestly, I don't notice much of a difference. Both have what I would say is an adequate underfoot responsiveness to them, where the Sokito sole plate is a little bit stiffer than the Alpha, but in general, I don't think that this is an element that should be a deciding factor between these two. They both get the job done. When it comes to traction, again, you have two really good options between the Alpha 2 and the Sokito Scudetta, where in the case of the Mizuno Alpha, you have a few extra studs in the forefoot, where I would argue that the pressure distribution is maybe a little bit better on the Mizunos than it is the Sokito, where if you are playing on natural grass, which you should be doing for either of these two boots, if it happens to be a little bit harder, this might be slightly more comfortable in the long run. The stud length is also slightly shorter, and the bladed triangular shape of the studs in general provide plenty of bite when pushing off, making this much more aggressive in terms of how it interacts with the ground than I think a lot of people might expect based on how it looks. Whereas the Scudetta maybe has the more unique traction pattern of the two, with these longer blades that pretty much line the edges of the heel and forefoot. The TRX bladed days from Adidas is maybe what comes to mind as a direct comparison, although I'd make the argument that this is maybe a little bit more aggressive. It also has a little bit of a chevron shape to the studs in the forefoot, where in terms of just outright bite and grip when pushing off, there's a little bit more of it here from the Sokito Scudetta than you get from the Alpha. So it is really a matter of personal preference, but in general, as far as speed boots go, both provide very aggressive traction. It is also worth noting that these are both FG stud patterns made predominantly for use on natural grass, where if you regularly play on AG surfaces, unfortunately, this is your only option for the Scudetta, where with the Mizuno Alpha 2, you can actually get it with an AG sole plate and stud pattern, and it's even $40 less expensive, meaning that you can get an AG-friendly, top-performing pair of high-end speed boots for $140. Another very important element of a pair of speed boots that some would argue actually has to do with how fast you can run, I would personally argue that it has more to do with feel, is how much they weigh, where while both of these boots are quite light, there is a noticeable difference between them. The Sokitos in a size 10, the Alphas in a 9.5, which as we'll talk about in just a second, is more or less the exact same size. We're gonna throw them on scale, starting off with the Sokito Scudetta, which as you can see, weigh in at 7.5 ounces, the equivalent of 213 grams. Change the scale back to ounces, and we'll throw on the Mizuno Alpha 2 Elite, and you can see that they weigh in at 6.85 ounces, the equivalent of 194 grams, which is nearly a 20 gram weight difference between these two in favor of the Alphas, where simply put, this is one of the lightest speed boots currently on the market. That is, of course, not to say that the Scudetta is a heavy pair of speed boots, but compared to other top-end options, it's on the upper end of weight. Still light, of course, but if you're of the opinion that every single gram counts, then certainly the Mizunos are the way to go. When it comes to fit and feel on feet, while both of these boots are undeniably very comfortable, they're achieving that comfort in ways that you wouldn't necessarily expect, where of course they're both speed boots, they're both going to have that tight fit, but based on the description of the softer, more pliable, forgiving upper of the Scudetta versus the more structured, responsive, kind of pingier synthetic material of the Textile Alpha 2, you'd probably expect the Scudetta to be the wider, more forgiving fit and feel. However, it's definitely the opposite, where the Scudetta is lower volume and generally just tighter across the entire foot, whereas the Alpha, despite the more structured upper, has more volume and more width that I would argue is going to be more accommodating to a wider variety of foot types. Of course, that is not to say that somebody with wide feet couldn't get away with wearing the Sokito Scudetta. It is ultimately a matter of personal preference when you're talking about fit and comfort. But if you need extra width and volume, the Mizuno Alpha 2 is basically as wide as you're going to find in the speed category without sacrificing lockdown and responsiveness because of the incredible adjustability as well as that zero glide liner helping to hold your foot in place. Having said that, with the laces tied tight, both boots fit extremely well. They both have that extra lacing position at the top where if you are finding that heel lockdown is potentially an issue, you can utilize that extra anchoring point to help hold your heel down and back inside of the football boots. The heel area on both boots I think is also top notch, plenty of depth, great overall fit, fantastic liners, no complaints from me there. And as far as underfoot feel with the sole plate is concerned, definitely the sole plate on the Scudetta is a little bit thicker and noticeably stiffer, but in general, I don't think that it's a major difference between these two in terms of the underfoot experience that you're going to have. Both feel really good. And then when it comes to sizing, that's where things can be a little bit tricky with both of these football boots, where in the case of the Mizunos, I'm wearing the Alpha 2 in my usual size 9.5 US, and I would say the boots as a whole run about a quarter size long. Not enough for me personally to go down half a size, because if I do that, the boots end up feeling a little bit too tight for my liking. But certainly if you're wearing a pair of football boots right now that run true to size and have some extra space, going down half a size in the Alpha 2 would not be a bad idea. Where in the case of the Sokito Scudetta, I'm wearing them in a size 10 US, which is half a size up from my normal size. And that's because the Sokito Scudetta as a whole has a really low volume, pretty snug fit through the toe box and forefoot area, while also running about a quarter to a half size small. Where I've worn this boot in my usual size 9.5, but I definitely have a pretty strong preference for going up half a size with this particular football boot, giving me that little bit of extra length without them feeling sloppy because of that lower profile shaping to the toe box in particular. So for the Scudetta, for the vast majority, I'd say going up half a size is probably not a bad idea. And in the case of the Alpha 2, true to size to half a size down, depending on preference, is probably the way to go. Again, both great fitting and super comfortable football boots in their own way, but at the same time, very different from each other. So in conclusion, and hopefully this goes without saying, there is not a bad choice between these two, but if I had to pick a winner on which I think is the better speed boot in the traditional sense, there is a pretty clear winner here in the Mizuno Alpha 2 Elite. Not only is it less expensive, and even less expensive than that if you need it with an AG stud pattern, something you don't have the option for with the Sokito Scudetta. It's the much lighter overall football boot. It fits every bit as well, is every bit as comfortable as long as you prefer that more raw feeling thin synthetic upper. And from a responsiveness standpoint, I don't think anything currently on the market beats it. Where if you want to feel fast, these will give you that at a much lower price tag than the more popular choices. However, if I personally had to pick a pair to play in, where as I've talked about throughout this entire video, personal preference is a huge factor when picking out a pair of speed boots, even though they aren't as light and maybe aren't as responsive, I really prefer the softer, more forgiving feel of the upper with the Sokito Scudetta that also fits incredibly well, offers really good traction, and in general is still a very responsive, top performing pair of speed boots. Where like I said, there's not a bad choice between them, it just depends on what type of fit and feel that you're looking for. So the next time you're on the market for a pair of top-end speed boots, instead of 3 stripes or a swoosh, consider a Runbird or whatever that is.